The thing about a film that doesn't quite exist yet, not fully, not as something you can sit down and actually watch, is that it lives entirely in your imagination. And there's something quietly pleasant about that. No runtime, no cuts you'd have done differently. No casting choice that didn't quite land for reasons you can't fully explain. Just the shape of a thing. The outline of a story, filled in however your brain decides to fill it in at this sort of hour. Avengers Doomsday, coming this December, has quite a particular shape. I've been thinking about it for a while. Not obsessively, just the way a thing keeps surfacing at the edges of other thoughts, especially late at night, especially when there's nothing demanding your attention. And it's the villain side of it specifically that keeps coming back around. The heroes will do what heroes do. Assemble, disagree, eventually manage something together. But the villains, and the confirmed former villains, and the people who occupy that genuinely interesting space somewhere between the two. There's a lot going on there. So that's what tonight is. A slow walk through every villain and villain-adjacent character that's been confirmed or very strongly reported for Avengers. Doomsday. Who they are. Where they're coming from. What makes them interesting when you turn them over slowly, rather than just clocking their presence in a cast announcement and moving on. We'll move through them at an easy pace, no countdown, no escalating drama. Just the characters, in more or less the order I find myself thinking about them at this hour, which is its own sort of order. One thing worth flagging before we get going, some of what I'll talk about tonight is genuinely confirmed, official cast announcements, verified interviews, things Marvel has stated directly. And some of it is sourced reporting from people with solid track records for this kind of thing, which is not the same as confirmed. I'll flag the difference as we go. It's useful to know what's established and what's still technically in the territory of very credible rumour when you're thinking about a film that hasn't come out yet. If this kind of unhurried conversation about a fictional universe is what you put on at night, I make these fairly regularly. There's a subscribe button somewhere nearby, genuinely no pressure, and I've got a long list of things I want to do this with, but that's enough of that. The March 2025 cast announcement for this film was something. A 5-hour live stream, which is an absurd amount of time to announce anything, and yet the cast justified it. 27 actors confirmed, one after another, building a picture of something almost embarrassingly large in scope. Not just MCU regulars, characters from the Fox X-Men franchise, returning after years away, in some cases over 2 decades. Characters from Thunderbolts and the Fantastic Four. First steps crossing over. And a man who spent the better part of 15 years playing the most beloved hero the franchise has ever produced, now confirmed to be playing the villain. That last detail is the one I keep coming back to. Robert Downey Jr. returning to Marvel, not as Tony Stark, but as Victor Von Doom, Dr. Doom. The most iconic villain Marvel Comics has produced in 60+ years, and quite possibly the one who required exactly this scale of film to do properly. The cast is also, when you look at it carefully, full of people who used to be on the wrong side of things. Magneto, Mystique, a character whose alternate personality can engulf a city in supernatural darkness without anyone being able to fight it conventionally. A former villain whose only goal was finding an end to the constant pain she'd been living with since childhood. An ancient king who not long ago was threatening to drown the surface world entirely. The line between confirmed villain and confirmed former villain, now fighting against a bigger villain, is genuinely blurry in Doomsday, which tells you something about where the MCU has landed. We'll start with the obvious one. The reason the film is called Doomsday at all. Because almost everything else on this cast list is, one way or another, downstream of him. Victor Von Doom. Let me start there, just with the name, because it's one of those names that should not work, and absolutely does. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby put him in Fantastic Four number 5 in 1962, and he's been here ever since. 60+ years of being the definitive megalomaniac genius in a universe that is genuinely overstocked with megalomaniac geniuses. The character at his core is a study in pride, not the petty kind, the enormous, architecturally impressive kind. He is the ruler of Latveria, a small fictional nation somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he considers himself its protector in the most paternalistic possible sense. His people in the comics are genuinely well cared for. No significant poverty, no crime worth speaking of. He rules through absolute authority and real competence, which is an uncomfortable combination when you're trying to file him simply as a villain and move on. Then there's the mask. The Iron Mask. The origin of the scar it covers has been told slightly differently across different eras of the comics. But the consistent element is this: an experiment went wrong, connected to his work alongside Reed Richards at university. An arcane device, a moment of hubris, a wound to his face. He designed and commissioned an iron mask to cover the damage. And in the most famous telling of that origin, he put the mask on before the metal had fully cooled, because his pride could not survive anyone seeing the wound, even for the moment it would have taken to set properly. That detail is difficult to shake. The mask going on while it's still hot. That's not just backstory, that's the whole character in a single image. A man so unable to tolerate vulnerability that he'd rather brand himself than be seen healing. He's also, uniquely, both a scientist and a sorcerer of comparable skill. Most Marvel characters are one or the other. Doom is both, at a level that makes him close to unkillable in any conventional sense. You beat him one way, and he has the other available. That specific combination of the technical and the arcane is a significant part of what makes him the particular threat he is. Now, the casting. Kevin Feige's framing of the Robert Downey Jr. announcement at San Diego Comic-Con 2024 was, he played the most iconic hero, so let him play the most iconic villain, which is the sort of thing that sounds better the longer you sit with it. There's a clean, almost too clean logic to it. Same face, completely different character. The audience arrives carrying 15 years of feeling about that face, about growth, about sacrifice, about a man in a cave deciding to be something better. And the film is going to put those feelings in a room with something that knows how to use them. Downey said he would only return if the Russo brothers came back as directors, which they did. He developed his own backstory for the character and contributed ideas for the costume. He reportedly speaks in a heavily accented voice for the role, and the Russos have confirmed that there will be a deliberate connection drawn between Victor Von Doom and Tony Stark in the film, that the script is not pretending the audience doesn't remember who used to wear that face. I want to come back to this later, because it's the kind of idea that's better arrived at slowly. What we know about Doom's MCU debut is actually quite specific. He appeared at the end of the Fantastic Four: First Steps, the 2025 film that introduced the Fantastic Four into the MCU, set in their own universe, Earth 828. The post-credits scene takes place 4 years after the main story. Sue Richards is reading to her young son in the Baxter Building. She leaves the room briefly. When she comes back, a figure in a flowing green cloak is crouched before the boy, holding a metal mask, back to the camera. And the boy, Franklin Richards, looks at this figure with curiosity rather than fear. That image, a small child touching the face of one of the most dangerous beings in the Marvel Universe, completely unafraid. It's a quietly effective introduction. Nothing is explained, nothing is announced. It just sits there, waiting. Franklin matters enormously in what we know about Doomsday's structure. His power was confirmed in the Fantastic Four: First Steps by Galactus himself. Reality warping, universe creating, the kind of ability that a cosmic devourer of planets considers extraordinary. In a story about universes collapsing into each other, a child who can create universes is not simply a hostage. He's a potential solution, or a potential weapon, depending entirely on who's pointing him. As for what Doom specifically wants, per what's been reported, though the film hasn't confirmed this officially, the most credible accounts suggest he's from the 31st century in another reality. That he was a king, that he had a family, a wife, reportedly called Sue von Doom, and 2 children, Franklin and Valeria, and that his universe was destroyed by a multiversal incursion. He survived. They didn't. If that backstory holds, he's not a villain who simply wants power. He's the survivor of a catastrophe, convinced that he alone has the will and the capability to prevent it from happening again by controlling what remains. Which is a shape we've seen before in this universe. The person who watched something terrible happen and decided the universe owed them the authority to fix it. The difference between Doom and the last villain who operated at this scale is the solution. That Oaz wanted to erase. Doom wants to control, to order, to rebuild in his image. He's not trying to thin the herd. He's trying to be God Emperor of the remaining reality. A hostile acquisition rather than a culling. And somehow, that's arguably worse because a God Emperor needs subjects, which means everyone else's existence becomes contingent on his preferences. Since we're already deep in Doom territory, and the film is drawing fairly clearly from a specific era of comics, it's worth spending a little time on the source material. Not a thorough survey, just the bits that feel like they're going to matter. The Secret Wars storyline from 2015, written by Jonathan Hickman, is the obvious place to start. It's the story that Avengers Doomsday and its sequel, Avengers Secret Wars, are reportedly drawing from, though how closely is anyone's guess until December arrives. The premise of that storyline runs roughly like this. Incursions, 2 universes occupying the same space and colliding with each other, have been happening across the multiverse for years. The heroes know about them. They've been trying to stop them. They have not managed to stop them. Eventually, almost the entire multiverse is destroyed. 2 universes remain, collide, and at the moment of final collision, 3 people intervene. Doctor Doom, Doctor Strange, and a character called the Molecule Man. They defeat the Beyonders, cosmic entities who were orchestrating the destruction of existence itself, apparently as an experiment of some kind, and Doom absorbs their power through the Molecule Man as a conduit. And then with that essentially godlike force, he creates Battleworld, a patchwork reality assembled from fragments of destroyed universes, which he then rules as God Emperor. He wins. That's the thing people sometimes forget about that storyline. Doctor Doom defeats God-level threats, saves what's left of existence, and appoints himself king of it. You can argue about what his kingship looked like in practice, and there are arguments to be made, but the core of it is that a villain, when pushed far enough and given the right circumstances, actually saved the universe. In his way, on his terms. The MCU's version of this appears to be substituting Franklin Richards for the Molecule Man. Same basic narrative function, a being who can act as a conduit for enormous cosmic power, who becomes central to Doom's plan. It's a clean substitution that the Fantastic Four first steps set up in advance, which is exactly what a good post-credits scene is supposed to do. A couple of other comics details feel relevant, even if they may not directly surface in the film. Doom's mother, Cynthia Von Doom, sold her soul to Mephisto, Marvel's version of the devil, and has been trapped in an infernal realm as a result. One of Doom's most consistent motivations across decades of comics is his ongoing attempt to free her. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, he attempts to negotiate her release. He has failed every time. There's something rather striking about that. The genius tyrant who spends one day a year trying to rescue his mum from hell. It doesn't make him good, but it makes him human in a way that plenty of villains simply aren't. And it's part of why he's lasted as a character. His relationship with Latveria is the other thing. He genuinely cares about his people, in the comics, not in a distant, abstract way, but in a present and protective way. The Latvian population, by most accounts within the comics, considers him a good ruler. That's the deeply uncomfortable part of the character. By the metrics you'd use to evaluate a head of state, he delivers. The problem is that he extends the same controlling logic outward from Latveria to the rest of the universe. And there things get considerably more complicated. The version of Doom the MCU is building seems to understand all of this. A man who loved something, who lost it through no clear fault of his own, who arrived at the conclusion that the only way to prevent loss is to be the one making all the decisions, which is both internally logical and catastrophic in practice, and a film that takes 2.5 hours of these people's lives had better be honest about both of those things simultaneously. The version that's actually frightening isn't a Doom who wants to destroy. It's a Doom who's convinced he's the only adult left in the room, and who has, it must be said, a fair amount of evidence to support that view about the specific quality of his capability. And then there's Magneto. This is where the film starts to feel genuinely strange in the best possible way. Ian McKellen was confirmed in that March 2025 livestream, returning to the role of Eric Lehnsherr for the first time since X-Men, Days of Future Past, in 2014. He was 85 or thereabouts at the time of filming. He first played the character in X-Men in the year 2000. 25 years with the same role, even accounting for the decade gap in between. That doesn't get talked about enough in all the announcement noise. The character, for anyone whose primary Marvel experience comes through the MCU without the Fox X-Men films, Eric Lehnsherr, known as Magneto, is a Holocaust survivor. That is the foundation. Everything else, the powers, the ideology, the conflict with Charles Xavier, is downstream of what he lived through as a child and what that did to his understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. He can generate and control magnetic fields at essentially unlimited scale. He is, in the X-Men's classification system, an Omega-level mutant, but the powers are almost secondary to the philosophy, which is not complicated once you understand where it comes from. Humans try to exterminate people he loved because they were different. They failed specifically in his case, but they succeeded broadly, and he spent his entire life watching patterns he recognized, repeating. The conclusion he drew, that humans will always eventually try to destroy what they fear, and that mutants cannot afford to wait, hoping to be the exception, is not an unreasonable reading of the evidence available to him. He's wrong about the solution. He's not wrong about the problem. That distinction matters. His relationship with Charles Xavier is the emotional center of the entire franchise. Two men who found each other, who love each other, who cannot agree on the most fundamental question, whether humanity is capable of doing better. Every X-Men film is essentially a longer version of that argument. Where McKellen's Magneto ends up in Days of Future Past is a version of him who has been around long enough to see his convictions complicated by experience. The older version of him, McKellen's version, ultimately fights alongside the X-Men to stop the Sentinels in the future timeline. It's not a redemption arc, exactly. More like a man who's tired of the same argument and has lived long enough to see what the alternative looks like up close. That was the last time we saw this specific version of him. In Doomsday, per what's been reported, and I want to be clear, this is reported, not confirmed, Magneto has, in the years since Days of Future Past, achieved something close to the mutant utopia he spent his life fighting for. A place where mutants are genuinely safe, not through compromise or surrender, because he kept at it long enough and with enough conviction that it actually happened. And Dr. Doom, reportedly, threatens that, which is what draws Magneto into the conflict. There's a layer to this that I find interesting. Doom threatening the one thing Magneto built that works, the mutant utopia, the realization of the goal that defined his entire adult life, would be Doom doing what Doom does, identifying what someone cannot lose, and making it the pressure point. We'll see the same pattern with Wanda. Find the thing a person cannot bear to lose, apply it. The Doom and Magneto dynamic in the comics has always been one of those pairings where two enormous forces briefly share a room and you can feel the potential energy. Two of the most intelligent beings on their respective sides, both convinced of their own clarity, both carrying genuine philosophical weight. Watching McKellen and Downey in that configuration on screen is a specific kind of event that you can't manufacture with lesser casting. And one more thing worth flagging, briefly. In original Marvel Comics continuity, Magneto is Wahan Dumax E. Moff's father. That connection was retconned years ago when the film rights to X-Men and Avengers were split between studios. With everything under one banner now, Doomsday could restore it. McKellen has spoken publicly about being interested in that possibility if Olsen returns to the franchise. I'll get to Wanda properly in her own section, but the thread is worth holding here. Alongside Magneto, there's Mystique, and the casting decision here is quietly its own story, entirely separate from anything happening in the film. Jennifer Lawrence played Raven Darkholme across 4 films between 2011 and 2019. Rebecca Romijn played her in the original trilogy from 2000 to 2006, plus a brief cameo in X-Men First Class. When Marvel confirmed the X-Men cast for Doomsday, they brought back Romijn, not Lawrence. That's a deliberate choice. I think it's the right one, though I recognise it's not a universally held view. Romijn's version of the character was, simply put, more fully what the character is supposed to be, completely blue, uncompromising in her physicality, not apologising for how she looked or how she moved. The prequel films progressively covered Jennifer Lawrence up more and more, partly because she's a star, and you can't quite hide a star behind blue prosthetics, and partly because the prequel character arc, a young woman learning to be comfortable in her own skin, created the somewhat peculiar dynamic of a shapeshifter, spending 3 films slowly becoming less shapeshiftery. Romijn's version didn't have that tension. She was just Mystique. All of it, all the time. Her version of the character moved the way someone would move if they genuinely had no conventional body to fall back on as a default. There's a physicality there that the later films, for all their strengths, didn't quite match. The character's history across the Fox films runs from pure antagonist, Magneto's lieutenant in the Brotherhood of Mutants in the original trilogy, his most visually distinctive right hand, to a considerably more sympathetic figure in the prequel timeline. The prequels gave her a backstory, a young woman who had been hiding her appearance her entire life, who found in Magneto and his arguments a permission she'd never been given before, the freedom to exist without the costume of normalcy. Her arc across those films is a kind of becoming, which carries an irony that's hard to ignore. The shapeshifter who spent multiple films learning to stay as herself. I don't know if that was always the intention, but it's what the character ended up meaning. By the end of the Fox timeline, she'd shifted considerably toward Xavier's side. Never completely, but enough that calling her simply a villain feels like it misses something. She was, in the most honest version of it, a person who kept deciding whose side she was on, and occasionally got it wrong. In Doomsday, she's most likely landing somewhere on the heroic side of the line, or at least the side opposing Doom. Her shape-shifting, in a film about variant versions of everyone, and things not being what they appear to be, is a deliberately chosen asset. A character who can look like anyone, in a story about alternate selves and colliding realities. The possibilities there feel intentional rather than incidental. There's also something worth noting about what Mystique brings to the X-Men's interpersonal dynamics that the other returning characters don't. She was never purely Xavier's or purely Magneto's. She always operated in the space between those two poles, making her own assessments about which direction made sense at any given moment. In a film where Magneto may initially find himself on the wrong side of things, pulled there by Doom's manipulation, Mystique's independence from any single allegiance makes her one of the more unpredictable elements in the ensemble. Not volatile, just genuinely her own person, which, in a story full of people defined by their loyalty to a cause or a leader, is a specific kind of strength. How much screen time she gets, and whether her relationship with Magneto is central or peripheral, is something we'll know when December arrives. But the decision to bring back Romin specifically, rather than Lawrence, or a new actress in the role, says something about what Marvel is trying to do with the X-Men's last chapter in this era. This is a reunion. It's being played as one. The X-Men arriving in Doomsday isn't just Magneto and Mystique. It's a proper ensemble of returning actors, and each one comes with their own set of circumstances that make the return interesting for different reasons. Let me go through them. Beast Kelsey Grammer first played Hank McCoy, blue fur, enormous physical capability, scientifically brilliant, impeccably dressed even in combat situations, in X-Men: The Last Stand in 2006. He appeared briefly in the future timeline of Days of Future Past in 2014, and then he was there, unmistakably, in the post-credits scene of The Marvels in 2023. Sitting in a facility, just by being present, confirming that the Fox X-Men universe exists somewhere in the MCU's expanded multiverse. That cameo was a promise. Doomsday appears to be the delivery of it. The interesting casting note here is that Nicholas Hoult played a younger version of the same character across 4 prequel films and did well with it, but Grammer's version is the one most people consider definitive, despite having considerably less screen time. Part of it is that his version aligns more closely with the animated series Beast that a generation of viewers grew up with. The erudite, measured quality, the slightly formal bearing. Part of it is that he managed to convey a great deal with the character in The Last Stand, which is not, by most honest assessments, a good film, and still came out of it with the character intact. That's not easy. In Doomsday, he's presumably functioning as both a scientific asset, Hank McCoy's PhD count being genuinely impressive, even by Marvel standards, and as a bridge between the X-Men and a team of heroes they've never shared a screen with before. Nightcrawler, Alan Cumming. This one is its own quiet story. Cumming appeared in live action exactly once, in X2, X-Men United in 2003, and then didn't come back for Days of Future Past, despite the film reuniting much of the original cast. The reasons aren't difficult to find. The experience on X2 under Bryan Singer was not a positive one, and when Singer returned for Days of Future Past, Cumming chose not to be involved. That's fair enough. The Russo brothers are not Bryan Singer, and so here we are, more than 20 years later, with Nightcrawler back. Cumming mentioned in interviews that the makeup process has been reduced from 4.5 to 5 hours, down to roughly 90 minutes, largely through improvements in the technology, which is presumably a relief. Nightcrawler's power, teleportation via brief displacement through a dimension the comics call the Brimstone Dimension, reappearing in a puff of sulphurous smoke, makes him one of the most tactically interesting X-Men for a large ensemble film. You can put him almost anywhere, almost instantly. In a story that's apparently cutting between multiple theatres of action, that's not just visually satisfying, it's narratively useful. Cumming has mentioned a sequence involving Nightcrawler and Reed Richards, a blue demonic-looking German teleporter facing off against the most elastically adaptable scientist in the universe. On paper, that's a genuinely interesting fight to imagine. Cyclops James Marsden. The Fox films were, across their entire run, rather unkind to Scott Summers. He is, in the comics, the definitive X-Men leader, the tactician, the field commander, the person Charles Xavier trusted above anyone else to actually run the team in practice. In the films, he was sidelined consistently, underserved even in the films where he was nominally central, and then killed off early in The Last Stand in a way so perfunctory it almost reads as intentional. X-Men 97, the animated series from 2024, reminded anyone who'd forgotten what a genuinely great character Cyclops is when someone cares about him properly. Marsden's return in Doomsday is the closest thing to cinematic justice the character's likely to get before the MCU eventually recast the X-Men entirely. Per some of what's been reported, and this is heavily in the reported, not confirmed category, there may be a sequence involving Cyclops and the Phoenix Force that would represent the emotional payoff the Fox films never got around to providing. I'll leave the specifics vague because that feels like something better encountered without too much foreknowledge. Gambit Channing Tatum. His story with this role deserves a moment because it's been a long road. He lobbied for years to play Gambit in a solo film, which was greenlit and then cancelled when Disney acquired Fox. He finally got a cameo in Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024, in which the Cajun accent was deployed as an extended running joke. Thick, unintelligible, played deliberately for comedy. For Doomsday, he's confirmed the comedy accent is not the approach this time. The Russos wanted a more dramatically grounded register for the film overall. Tatum is playing it accordingly. Gambit's power, charging objects with kinetic energy, causing them to explode on contact, is simple, visually spectacular, and exactly suited to a large-scale ensemble battle. There's a reason the character became iconic in the animated series. Cards thrown at things that then explode is not a complicated idea, but it's a good one. My honest position, Deadpool and Wolverine prove Tatum understands the energy of the character. Even in a comedic context, a serious version has real potential. Full judgment reserved until I've actually seen it. Loki is a different kind of entry on this list, and worth saying that clearly before we get into him. Because by the time Doomsday happens, he's not a villain. He's not even a hero in any conventional sense. He's something considerably stranger. Tom Hiddleston is confirmed for the film. His role is apparently so central to the story's most significant plot developments that Marvel has been quite deliberately absent about featuring him in marketing so far. He wasn't in the CinemaCon footage, he hasn't turned up in the teasers. Given how many characters have had dedicated marketing moments, his absence is conspicuous, which usually means the character's arc is something the film doesn't want pre-explained. To understand why Loki matters so specifically to Doomsday, you need to know where the Loki series left him. The Season 2 finale, and this is the kind of ending that gets better the longer you sit with it, finds him in an impossible situation. The TVI's temporal loom, the device that holds all the branching timelines together and prevents them from collapsing, is failing. Beyond saving. Every attempt to fix it fails. He watches the people he cares about erased again and again through time loops he can't escape, and eventually he arrives at a conclusion that is both heroic and quietly devastating. He seizes the branches of all the existing timelines himself, holds them physically through sheer will. He becomes the point at which all threads converge, the being sitting at the nexus of all realities, maintaining their stability by never letting go. Not the god of mischief any longer, not a hero in any conventional sense either, something beyond those categories. The show describes him as the god of stories. He exists beyond the multiverse, which means he's not in any single timeline. He's the structure holding the timelines apart from each other. That status makes him Doom's primary target, according to the reports that have been coming out about Doomsday's structure. If Doom's goal involves remaking or seizing control of the multiverse, using incursions, using Franklin Richards, using whatever else he's assembled, the single entity standing between Doom and that goal is the one currently holding the whole thing together through will alone. Thor and Steve Rogers apparently have a significant arc in this film built around protecting Loki from doom, which is a sentence I would not have predicted being able to say in 2012. And that long view from 2012 to now is what makes Loki's position in Doomsday so interesting as a piece of storytelling. He was the reason the Avengers had to exist. The Battle of New York in the first Avengers film, the invasion he organised, the army he borrowed from Thanos' intermediary, the Tesseract he tried to use, was the event that forced 6 people who would not otherwise have agreed to be in the same room to function as a team. Without Loki as the common threat, there is no assembled Avengers. He created the team, accidentally and entirely against his intention. And now, 12 plus years and 2 full series later, he is the thing those Avengers need to protect in order to protect everything else. The villain who accidentally assembled the team is now the structure the team exists to defend. His path from there to here is one of the more complete arcs in the MCU, from conqueror to reluctant ally to something like genuine heroism to finally cosmic guardian. What that path cost him is a long conversation for another video, but the end point of it, sitting at the centre of all timelines, holding them in place, while something enormously powerful works its way toward him, is the version of Loki that feels like it could only have arrived through the full length of the journey. The emotional stakes for Doomsday are somewhat different from the usual final confrontation structure, partly because of him. If Doom reaches Loki, if he removes the thing holding the multiverse's stability in place, the collapse that follows isn't a battle they can win their way out of. It's structural. It's the end of the frame before the painting. What Doom could actually do to Loki, given that Loki now exists outside conventional reality, and what that confrontation looks like, is presumably a significant portion of what the film's runtime is devoted to. That it involves Thor and Steve Rogers specifically, the 2 people who knew him longest and in the most complicated way, feels like a deliberate choice. That confrontation carries history that the film won't need to explain from scratch. There's one confirmed character in Doomsday who I think is going to matter considerably more than the marketing has suggested so far, and that's Sentry, or more precisely, that's Bob Reynolds. And the thing inside him that he's been carefully not letting out, Lewis Pullman plays him. He's in the confirmed cast. And per what's been reported, he's described alongside Thor and Doctor Doom as one of the 3 most important characters in the film's overall structure. Bob Reynolds is a character new enough to the MCU that not everyone will have come across him. So let me set up who he is, because the setup is the whole story. He's ordinary to begin with. That's the important thing. He wasn't born with abilities, he didn't acquire them through some indirect consequence of being in the wrong place at a dramatically significant moment. He volunteered for an experimental enhancement procedure run by a military-industrial organisation called the OXE Group, and he volunteered because he was profoundly, desperately lonely, and the program offered something that felt like purpose. The woman running the program, Val N.T.E. Na A Leg Ru Du Fontaine, the CIA director who assembled the Thunderbolts, oversaw the experiments that created him. She knew exactly what he needed to hear. She told him she believed in him. She offered acceptance, and someone who has spent their life convinced they're fundamentally unlovable doesn't have great defenses against an offer like that. The serum gave him power that by all available estimates exceeds all the Avengers combined. Strength, flight, the ability to alter matter and energy at a level the MCU has barely gestured at before. What the serum could not do was address what was underneath. The psychological damage, the self-hatred, the deep conviction that he was broken and undeserving remained completely intact. The power just gave it more room to expand, and the darkness took on a shape and a name of its own. The Void. The Void is Bob's worst self given cosmic form. In Thunderbolts, when it emerges, it engulfs New York City in supernatural darkness. Not just light-blocking darkness, dimensional darkness, creating pocket spaces where people experience manifestations of their deepest fears and worst memories. It's psychological horror at a citywide scale, and it's stopped not through force. You cannot fight the void with strength, which removes most of the Avengers' conventional toolkit, but through genuine human connection. Yelena Belova going into the darkness, finding Bob in his psychological safe space, staying with him until the despair that feeds the void runs out of fuel. Thunderbolts ends with Bob being held, being told he's not alone, the darkness receding because someone chose to love him without condition, which the void apparently doesn't know how to process. He chose, at the end of that film, not to become Sentry. He chose Bob. The team is now keeping him close, partly because they care about him and partly because, in Lewis Pullman's own words from a recent interview, they understand that if he's in the wrong hands or not being supported enough, he might be dangerous. Dr. Doom is emphatically the wrong hands. Per what's been leaked about Doomsday's structure, all of this is unconfirmed. Worth emphasizing, Doom has some form of direct interaction with the Void during the film. One report mentions him potentially absorbing or interfacing with the Void's force in some way. A production detail from the filming period, a structure built at Windsor Great Park for Doomsday, was named after Annie Reynolds, Sentry's mother, and was described as connected to the Void's presence in the story. The logic of Doom trying to use the Void as a weapon is internally consistent with how this character operates throughout the film. He doesn't defeat enemies through conventional force. He repurposes. He finds what exists and reshapes it to serve his goal. The Void is a potentially unlimited destructive force that happens to live inside a man who acquired it through no fault of his own. To someone with Doom's mindset, that's not a tragic situation. That's a resource. The thing that keeps coming back to me, thinking about Sentry in this film, is that the Void isn't evil in any intentional sense. It's pain. It's Bob's worst day given cosmic scale and its own physical form. The threat it represents in Doomsday isn't the Void deciding to do harm. It's the possibility of a good man being weaponized because what he carries inside him happens to be, in the right circumstances, unprecedented in its destructive capacity. One name keeps surfacing in discussion about this film, even though Marvel hasn't officially put it in writing. Elizabeth Olsen, Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch. A specific caveat before we get into it: Wanda is not officially confirmed for Avengers Doomsday. What this section covers is a combination of persistent reports from sources with established track records, long-standing teasers from both the actress and Marvel executives across multiple interviews, and leaked plot details that feel credible given the broader shape of what we know. All of it is possible. None of it is certain. Where the character left off. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, 2022. Wanda had been corrupted by the Dark Hold. A book of dark magic the WandaVision series established had been influencing her, and she spent that film moving between alternate realities, trying to reach a universe where her children, Billy and Tommy, existed. Her arc in that film is one of the more unsettling things the MCU has done. The person audiences had been asked to care about across multiple projects becomes, for extended stretches, the most frightening figure on screen. And the film doesn't flinch from it. Her ending is deliberately ambiguous. She destroys Wundagore Mountain, the fortress that housed the primary source of the Darkhold's corrupting power, apparently taking herself with it. But the destruction is filmed in a way that leaves the door open. Apparently, was chosen carefully. Both Elizabeth Olsen and Marvel executives have teased her return publicly, promising that if she came back, it would give the character proper justice. Whatever that means, it at least suggests the intention isn't to simply reverse her Multiverse of Madness arc and pretend it didn't happen. What reportedly happens in Doomsday, per what's been leaked, and all of this is flagged as unconfirmed, is that Doom visits Wundagore Mountain early in the film and uses Franklin Richards' power to resurrect Wanda. He then recruits her as a lieutenant. The offer, reportedly, is a world where Billy and Tommy exist, a reality where she gets her children back. The emotional logic of this is unfortunately sound. Doom doesn't need to force Wanda into anything. He doesn't need the dark hold or a corrupting influence or a book of dark magic to point her in a particular direction. He just needs to offer her the one thing she genuinely cannot say no to. And she's a person who, by the end of Multiverse of Madness, had already demonstrated exactly how far she was willing to go for that specific thing. The precedent exists. What makes this potentially interesting rather than simply bleak is the question of agency. If she goes in knowing what Doom actually is and what his plan involves, choosing his offer with full information, that's a more complicated version of the character than a simple resurrection and recruitment story. A woman who decides the one specific thing outweighs her knowledge of what she's becoming. That version of Wanda is harder to watch and harder to dismiss. Wanda at full capacity is theoretically the most powerful being in the MCU. The Scarlet Witch's chaos magic, as described in the source material and gestured at in Multiverse of Madness, is capable of things that most conventional power sets can't approach or counter. If Doom has her alongside him, the heroes have a problem of a significantly different order. And there's a thread connecting to what we talked about with Magneto. In original Marvel Comics continuity, Magneto is Wanda's father. That relationship was retconned away years ago due to film rights, and Marvel Comics moved to give Wanda a different origin during that period. With Disney owning both franchises now, the door to restoring it is open. If both McKellen and Olsen are in this film, and both are aligned with Doom, a father and daughter working alongside each other in service of a villain who offered each of them something they couldn't refuse, is a dark and quietly compelling structure. I won't push that further than a flag. It's speculation layered on speculation, but it's the kind of thread that, if the film picks it up, would recontextualize a lot of what came before it. Coming back down from that to more grounded territory, at least in terms of the specific quality of the grievance, there's Namor. Tenoch Huerta's version appeared in Wakanda Forever in 2022, and the reimagining of the character there is one of the more interesting creative decisions in that film. Namor debuted in Marvel Comics in 1939, alongside an android version of the Human Torch, and is typically depicted as light-skinned with black hair. The film made him Mesoamerican, the ruler of Talocan, an underwater civilization descended from indigenous people who fled colonial violence centuries ago by drinking from a plant enriched with vibranium, which allowed them to live underwater but cost them the ability to survive on the surface. That origin isn't decoration. It's the foundation of everything about him. His people fled because the surface world was not safe for them. They have stayed hidden because the surface world has remained not safe for them. His entire worldview is built on an accurate historical reading of what happens when powerful nations discover something they want. When the threat of discovery arrives in Wakanda Forever, his response, strike first before they find you, before they have a chance to do what they always do, is not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. It's someone who has the receipts reading those receipts correctly and drawing the practical conclusion. He's wrong about the answer. He's not wrong about the history. The specific kind of antagonist that creates is one who you can follow completely through the logic of their position and still end up at this isn't the right response rather than this person is simply bad. The film handles that carefully. The Wakanda Forever conflict resolves in a truce with Shuri, not a friendship, not a full alliance, not a resolved relationship. A truce which is a meaningfully different thing. He agreed to stop. He didn't agree to anything positive. In Doomsday, both Namor and Namora, Mabel Cadena, confirmed cast, are in the film. His role appears to be that of a reluctant ally, fighting alongside the Avengers and the Wakandans, not because he's resolved his feelings about any of them, but because the threat Doom represents is one that extends to Talokan as well. A collapsing multiverse doesn't stop at the ocean floor. What kind of threat could accomplish that? Could make someone with Namor's specific historical justification for not trusting surface alliances extend his protection outward is a genuinely interesting structural question. The answer the film appears to be providing is one large enough that being right about the surface world's past behaviour becomes less important than the thing happening right now. There's something almost satisfying about that as a character position. He spent Wakanda forever being entirely correct about the danger and entirely wrong about the solution. He's been discovered, the surface world has turned out to be manageable, and now the threat that actually required him to step outside the walls he built is entirely different from what his historical model predicted. What I find interesting about Namor specifically, in the context of everything else on tonight's list, is how different his wrongness is from Doom's or Wanda's. He didn't arrive at his position through grief or through a wound that calcified. He arrived at it through a clear-eyed reading of history that happens to be accurate. His error isn't analytical, it's methodological. He drew the right conclusions about the problem and the wrong conclusions about the appropriate response, which is arguably a harder trap to escape than one built on emotion. You can't simply address the feeling underneath Namor the way you might with someone else on this list. You have to actually argue with the evidence, and the evidence, unfortunately, is on his side. History doesn't always work the way you were prepared for. One of the things I find genuinely interesting about the confirmed cast for this film, when you look at it carefully, is how many of the people on the heroic side of the ledger used to be something else. John Walker, Ghost, Red Guardian, the New Avengers. As a whole, really, which is how most of them have arrived in Doomsday. These are not characters who came to heroism cleanly. Most of them arrived at it through a specific kind of reckoning, and it's worth sitting with that for a moment, rather than just filing them as former villains, now heroes, moving on. John Walker first, because his arc is the sharpest illustration of a pattern the MCU has been developing for a while. Wyatt Russell's Walker was introduced in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier in 2021 as the government's answer to the question of what to do with the Captain America mantle once Steve Rogers stepped back. He was appointed decorated soldier, genuinely decorated, 3 medals of honor, which the show points out almost no one in history has earned. Genuinely brave, all the right credentials on paper. What the film is careful about is not making him a cartoon. It makes him a person handed a symbol that carried a weight he didn't understand, in circumstances that made carrying it, well, essentially impossible. His closest friend was killed. He was using an enhancement serum to physically keep pace with opponents, considerably stronger than an unaugmented human. He was under pressure from every direction simultaneously. And then he did the thing the symbol was never supposed to do. He killed someone publicly, with the shield, on camera in front of everyone. The specific horror of that moment isn't that Walker is fundamentally bad. It's that he isn't. He's a person who came apart under a load the symbol was never designed for him to carry. The film makes a quiet argument that Steve Rogers wasn't Captain America because of the serum. He was Captain America because of who he already was before the serum, and the qualities that made him the right person for that specific symbol are not qualities you can appoint into someone by handing them the right equipment. Walker found that out the hard way. By thunderbolts, he's done the work to get somewhere more like himself, and by Doomsday, he's a confirmed member of the New Avengers. The most direct case study the MCU has offered in what the wrong person for a symbol actually means in practice, and whether it disqualifies someone permanently. Ghost, Ava Starr, played by Hannah John Kamen, might be the clearest case in the whole MCU of a villain who was barely one. Her origin from Ant-Man and the Wasp. As a child, she was caught in an accident involving quantum technology that left her molecules permanently unstable. She phases in and out of solid reality constantly. The phasing causes her continuous, grinding pain, and it's slowly killing her because the same instability that makes her difficult to fight is taking her apart at the molecular level. Everything she did in that film was in pursuit of a cure. Not power, not conquest, not ideology, a cure. The pain had been her whole reality since childhood. That's all she was ever trying to address. Her path toward achieving that intersected with the hero's path in ways that made her a danger to people she had no particular interest in harming, which is about as close to involuntary villainy as the MCU has produced. She was temporarily stabilized at the end of her film. She's a confirmed new Avenger, heading into Doomsday. Her phasing ability, in a film about multiversal instability, about things not holding together at a structural level, is practically a thematic detail as much as a practical one. Red Guardian, David Harbour's character, completes the set. He originally appeared in Black Widow in 2021, Soviet super soldier Natasha Romanoff's surrogate father figure from her cover family, played with a warmth and absurdity that makes him thoroughly impossible to dislike, even when he probably shouldn't be. He's confirmed for Doomsday, part of the new Avengers, doing whatever Red Guardian does in a film about the end of the multiverse, which I imagine involves a great deal of enthusiasm and at least one comment about his record. The broader point about this group is one that doesn't need over-explaining, because it's fairly apparent on the face of it. The MCU has spent years suggesting, through individual character arcs, that the distance between hero and villain is usually smaller than the genre typically allows. Doomsday is in some sense the practical consequence of that argument. The team assembling to fight Doctor Doom is full of people who know what the other side of that line looks like from close up. They spent time there. They know what it costs to cross it. Whether that makes them better equipped to understand the villain they're facing is something the film presumably addresses. There's one more category worth talking about before we move into the broader context of what this film is actually about. These characters are the most speculative on the list, but conceptually, they're among the most interesting. The villain variants. Per what's been reported, and this entire section sits firmly in the well-sourced but not officially confirmed category, which I want to be clear about. A group of antagonists from Earth 828. The Fantastic Four's home universe may play some role in Doomsday. The reported lineup: Superior Iron Man, Captain Hydra, Maestro Hulk, and a variant referred to as King Than Oeds. These are Dark Mirror versions of familiar heroes, not alternate versions of characters the audience has an existing relationship with, not someone's Tony Stark or Steve Rogers making different choices, presented as a variation on a friend. These are versions from a reality the audience has never visited, who came into existence as already different things. A Tony Stark with the genius and the armour and the conviction, but without the growth. A Steve Rogers on the wrong side of the argument that defined him. A Bruce Banner with the intelligence intact and whatever softens him, eroded away by something the film presumably doesn't need to spend much time explaining. What villain variants do in a multiverse story that conventional villains can't is make the familiar frightening without requiring any backstory. You don't need to be introduced to Superior Iron Man as a character with a history. You bring everything yourself, from the years you've spent with the original, and the variant just has to stand in front of all that accumulated feeling and be the wrong version of it. The wrong choice is wearing a recognizable face. That's a specific kind of cinematic effect that only works if the audience has the history. And in a room full of people who've seen a decade plus of MCU films, there's a lot of history in play. The King Than O's reference, for anyone interested in the comic specificity of it, is a deep cut, a variant from a particular storyline who exists in a universe he already conquered and destroyed, ruling over a dead reality, having accomplished everything he set out to do and found nothing particularly satisfying on the other side of it. Not the philosophical, sorrowful than-os of Infinity War. Something older and simpler and more purely conquering. And there's a layer to this particular section that's specific to Doomsday and to the casting of Robert Downey Jr. The audience is already arriving at this film with an unusual relationship to the villain's face. Downey as Doom, the actor who played the most beloved hero, now playing the primary villain, is already a doubled image. If evil variants of his former teammates simultaneously exist in the same story, then you have the strange situation of the original's dark reflection and the original's darker selves all sharing a narrative, mediated by the face that used to represent something entirely different. There's also something worth sitting with about what villain variants say about the nature of identity in a multiverse story. If a Steve Rogers who made different choices and became Captain Hydra is still Steve Rogers, in some meaningful sense, same intelligence, same strategic instincts, same face, then what exactly separates him from the Steve Rogers we know? The answer, presumably, is a specific sequence of choices and relationships and moments of being seen clearly by the right people, which is a fairly frightening thing to confront in a superhero film. The line between who we are and who we could have been is thinner than we tend to assume, and the multiverse is very good at putting that in front of you in a way you can't easily dismiss. Whether the film distributes that narrative weight gracefully is something we'll find out in December, but as a conceptual piece of design, it's one of the bolder things the MCU has attempted. It's worth stepping back at this point. We've covered a fair amount of ground in terms of individual characters, and just going through the actual threat backdrop of the film, because all of these villains exist within a larger framework that's been building across several phases of the MCU, and it's easier to understand why they're all here if you understand what here actually means. An incursion, as the MCU has defined it, is what happens when two universes occupy the same space and collide. They destroy each other, both of them. The concept was introduced most explicitly in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. There's a visual detail in that film, a scar on Strange's face described as an incursion scar caused by a universe where he'd triggered one, and a scene where the Illuminati's entire reality is obliterated when Wanda crosses into it and destabilizes the local timeline. The implication is that these collisions are theoretically preventable, but also, once they start happening at scale, extremely difficult to stop. The trail of events that led to incursions becoming a genuine problem runs back through several films. Spider-Man: No Way Home cracked the multiverse open accidentally. The fractured spell pulled beings from other universes across and damaged the barriers between realities as a consequence. The Marvels had Emon Iku Rambo fall through into an alternate universe and become stranded there, and the Loki series established the structural foundation of the whole thing. The sacred timeline, which he who remains had maintained by pruning branching realities, was shattered when Sylvie killed him. That produced infinite branches. Infinite branches in a multiverse without anyone managing them will eventually bump into each other. And when they bump hard enough, you get incursions. This is the world Doomsday takes place in. A multiverse with no centralized management except Loki alone, holding the threads by choice through an act of will that cannot last indefinitely against pressure of this scale. Doom's position in this, if his reported backstory is accurate, is not as the cause of incursions. He survived one. He lost everything he loved to one. He understands exactly what they are and exactly what they lead to. His plan, whatever specific form it takes in the film, involves preventing the remaining collapse by being the one who decides what gets to exist. The solution that requires everyone else's universe to operate within his preferences. What's interesting about that framing is that the heroes don't actually have an alternative plan. They have a plan to stop Doom. That's not the same thing. Defeating Doom doesn't solve the incursion problem, it just removes his particular proposed solution. The film will presumably have to sit with that, at least briefly. The villain is wrong about the method. That doesn't automatically make the heroes right about the fix. Franklin Richards sits at the centre of this as the potential tool. Established in the Fantastic Four, first steps as possessing power that Galactus himself, a cosmic entity who consumes planets for sustenance, described as exceeding even his own scale. A child who can create pocket universes and reshape reality in ways that have no conventional ceiling. In a story about universes collapsing, a being who can make new ones is either the answer or the most dangerous resource in existence, depending entirely on who has access to him. Doom apparently wants to use Franklin the way Hickman's Secret Wars comics used the Molecule Man, as a conduit for the power required to build something stable in the ruins of everything that's collapsed. Whether the film frames Doom's use of Franklin as exploitation or as something more ambivalent is one of the things I'm genuinely curious about. The comics version of that storyline doesn't present Doom's use of that power as simply villainous. It presents it as the decision of someone who won, and who won because no one else was willing to do what was necessary. Whether the MCU is brave enough to hold that ambivalence, or whether it will ultimately simplify Doom into something more conventionally defeatable, that's probably the central creative question of whether this film lands the way it could. I want to come back to one last thing about Doctor Doom before we bring this to a close. The thing that feels like the quiet heart of why this film is structured the way it is. In the comics, the parallel between Victor Von Doom and Tony Stark has always been there, mostly by implication. Both engineers of extraordinary ability, both armoured, both deeply convinced that they are the most capable person in any room they occupy, both driven by specific losses, Doom by the wound to his pride and the death of his mother, Stark by the realisation in that cave in Afghanistan of what his company had been building for and who it had been building it for. The difference is what happened next. Tony Stark spent 11 films learning, slowly and at significant cost, that the armour was not the point. That controlling everything was not the solution it appeared to be when you first thought of it. That the thing worth protecting was not an abstraction or a legacy, but a small specific collection of people he loved. And at the end, he made a choice that gave up everything he'd built in service of bringing back what had been taken. Victor Von Doom is the version of that story where the arc never happened. Not because he's inherently worse as a person, because the circumstances didn't provide the things that cracked Tony open. The right people at the right moments, the losses that forced him to look at what he'd built differently. In Doom's reported backstory, he did have those things. A family, a home, people he loved, and then a catastrophe took them. And what was left is a man with all the genius and the armour and the certainty, and none of the softening that came from learning what the armour was actually for. The Russos have confirmed the film will draw a deliberate connection between these two characters, that it won't pretend the audience doesn't have 15 years of feeling about that face. Downey himself developed a specific personal backstory for Doom as internal reference, separate from anything the script explicitly states. And the result of that is, apparently, a performance that sits in a particular relationship to everything the audience knows from watching Tony Stark. What that connection looks like in practice is something I'd rather not speculate about too specifically, because the surprise of it, whatever form it takes, is presumably one of the moments in this film that lands hardest for audiences who followed the MCU from the beginning. The moment when the face you associate with sacrifice is asked to represent something else, when your memory of Iron Man is required to coexist in the same image with something it can't quite accommodate. What I find worth sitting with, and this is the thing that's been turning over in my head more than anything else tonight, is how close Doom's conviction is to something recognisable. A man who builds himself an armor because he can't tolerate vulnerability. Who decides controlling the outcome is the only way to be safe from losing anything else. Who is genuinely brilliant enough that the armor works at the scale he's operating at. Tony Stark had Pepper. He had Morgan. He had a team of people who loved him differently than he loved himself, who reached him at the moments when he was most convinced he didn't need to be reached. He had, frankly, quite a lot of luck. The luck of being broken in front of the right people at the right time, so that the breaking became the beginning of something rather than a final position. Doom reportedly had all of that. A wife, children, a kingdom, and then an incursion took it. And what remained was just the armor and the certainty and a conviction that the universe owed him the authority to ensure it didn't happen again. That's not a cartoon villain. That's a particular kind of tragedy. The man who could have been the hero of a different story in different circumstances, convinced beyond any possibility of persuasion that what he's doing is the only thing a clear-eyed person could possibly conclude. And here's the wrinkle that I find most interesting as we get close to the film actually arriving. The heroes are going to stop him, and they're probably right to, but they're stopping him without a plan for the thing he was trying badly to address, which means somewhere after the credits roll on Doomsday and before Avengers, Secret Wars arrives in December 2027, the multiverse is still collapsing, Loki is still holding it together alone, and the one person who had a specific proposal for what to do about it will have been beaten. I don't know what the solution to that is. Nobody outside the production knows yet. But it's the thing I'll be thinking about between now and December. Since we're talking about Doctor Doom, and we have been for a while now, from different angles, it's worth spending some time on the relationship that's genuinely central to why Doom is the specific villain he is. Not the multiverse, not the incursions, not even the mask really. The rivalry with Reed Richards. Pedro Pascal plays Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, the leader of the Fantastic Four in the MCU. He's confirmed for Doomsday, crossing over from Earth 828 alongside the rest of the team. And the relationship between Reed and Doom is, in the comics, one of the longest running and most densely layered rivalries in all of superhero fiction. It's been going since 1962, and it has never fully resolved, which is probably the correct outcome for something this psychologically complicated. The version of it the MCU is working with is necessarily abbreviated. They can't spend 3 hours establishing 60 years of mutual history between two characters who've only just been introduced. But the shape of it is already in place from the Fantastic Four, First Steps, and the post-credits scene with Franklin does the work of making it personal in a way that the comics take years to build. In the comics, the basic shape of the rivalry goes like this. Doom and Richards were students at the same university, both brilliant, both working at a level significantly beyond what anyone around them could follow. In Doom's origin, the accident that scarred his face happened in an experiment he conducted, and Doom blamed Richards for the outcome, because Richards allegedly warned him about a mathematical error in his calculations, and Doom, in his pride, dismissed the correction. Whether Richards actually warned him, or Doom invented that detail retroactively, as a convenient explanation for his failure, is left deliberately ambiguous. Doom believes it. That belief has shaped his entire subsequent relationship with Reed Richards, which is interesting. The defining wound of the most powerful villain in Marvel's history may have been entirely self-inflicted, and he has spent decades organising his entire worldview around the narrative that it was someone else's fault. That's a very specific kind of psychology, and it's one that feels deeply consistent with what we know about the MCU's version of the character. Someone who cannot tolerate the possibility that he made a mistake, who will construct an entire alternative account of events to avoid sitting with that, who then devotes essentially limitless intelligence and resources to proving that the person who witnessed his failure is less than him in every conceivable way. Reed Richards, in that framing, is not just Doom's enemy. He's the walking evidence of Doom's fundamental insecurity. As long as Reed exists and is admired and does things that get attributed to his genius, Doom cannot fully believe his own narrative. And Doom's narrative is everything to him. In Doomsday, this is complicated further by the reported backstory. If Doom is from an alternate universe where he was married to that universe's Sue Storm, the woman who, in this universe, is married to Reed Richards, then the rivalry becomes something considerably more personal than a decades-long academic grudge. It becomes the situation of a man who lost his family to an incursion and then arrived in a universe where a version of that family exists, married to and building a life with someone else. That's not a villain-hero rivalry. That's a tragedy wearing the shape of a rivalry. Pedro Pascal's Reed Richards, from what we see in the Fantastic Four, first steps is warm, slightly distracted, genuinely brilliant in the way that absent-minded genius often presents, more interested in the problem in front of him than in being perceived as competent by observers. He and Doom, in that film, don't share scenes except indirectly, through that post-credits moment. But the sense of what's coming, of two versions of the same archetype on a collision course, is already there. The specific question of what Doom wants from this universe's version of his family, if the reported backstory is accurate, is the kind of thing that could either be deeply handled or completely not handled, and I genuinely don't know which this film is going to do. The comics version of Doom is someone whose emotional range is vast, but almost entirely unexpressed, which is a very specific acting challenge for someone like Downey to navigate. Whether he finds a way to let that tragedy breathe without turning it into something overly sentimental, without making Doom sympathetic in a way that undermines his threat, is one of the more interesting things to anticipate. The rivalry matters not just as backstory, it's the engine of the film's central conflict. Whatever Doom wants from the Richards family, and whatever Reed is willing to do to protect his wife and son, is presumably the personal thread running through the larger multiversal structure. And the films that work at this scale, the ones that land when everything else is chaos, are the ones where the enormous structural threat is grounded in something specific and human. One father who lost his family, another who won't. Now, talking about Doom's conviction and his genuine belief in his own rightness has reminded me of something I find interesting about the MCU villain roster as a whole. A pattern that's been running through the best of them for years now. And it's worth naming it directly, because Doom is in some ways the fullest expression of it. The pattern goes like this. The MCU's most effective antagonists are not people who think they're villains. They're people who think they're right. Not in that reflexive way where every bad guy assumes his own goals are obviously justified, but properly, carefully, structurally right, people who have thought it through, who have premises and logic chains, who arrived at their monstrous conclusions through a chain of reasoning that holds together internally. The clearest previous example is Thanos. His argument was built out. Titan died exactly the way he'd predicted it would, and the universe is making the same mistake at larger scale. He's almost certainly wrong about whether removing half of life actually solves the underlying problem. It resets the clock rather than fixing the maths. But from inside his own experience, watching the world he loved die precisely as he warned, his conviction had hardened into something closer to certainty. And certainty in someone with that kind of power is what makes a villain genuinely frightening, rather than simply dangerous. Killmonger in Black Panther is another version of this, and in some ways a cleaner one. His indictment of Wakandu, that a hidden nation with unlimited technological advantage watched the African diaspora suffer for generations and did nothing because doing nothing was more comfortable than being visible, is not wrong. The film is explicit about this. The villain's critique lands. the kingdom changes in response to it. You can follow Killmonger's entire reasoning chain to the moment before his solution and agree with everything, and then disagree completely with what he does next. That gap between the accurate analysis and the monstrous response is where the character lives. Doom is a version of this pattern taken to its ultimate scale. His analysis of the multiverse situation isn't wrong. The sacred timeline is broken, incursions are happening, Loki is holding reality together alone and can't do so indefinitely and without intervention at the level of fundamental structure. What's coming is the end of everything. He's not inventing a problem. The problem is real, and the heroes are not equipped to address it in the way he's proposing to. What he's wrong about is the solution. Specifically, he's wrong about whether his solution can be implemented without removing everyone else's ability to exist as sovereign beings. A God Emperor doesn't just prevent incursions. A God Emperor also means that every universe, every timeline, every version of reality exists within his permission structure. That's not a universe saved, that's a universe restructured as an extension of one person's will. The thing that makes Doom the most fully realised version of this pattern isn't just the scale, it's the specific wound underneath. Awash wanted balance because he watched his world die. Killmonger wanted redress because he was abandoned by the nation that should have been his. Doom wants control because he had everything, lost everything to a structural failure he could not prevent, and has devoted every subsequent resource to ensuring he is never again in a position where something can be taken from him by forces outside his management. That's not a villain origin. That's a specific human response to a specific kind of loss, scaled to cosmic proportions. The reason these characters work, the reason they sit with you after the film is over, is that you can understand the path from the loss to the conviction without being able to endorse where they ended up. And the specific weight of Downey playing this particular version of this particular archetype, after spending 15 years playing the version of it who learned the lesson, is the context that Doomsday is counting on the audience to bring through the door with them. It won't work for anyone seeing their first Marvel film, but for everyone else there's a specific emotional undertow to watching that face in that position, and I think the Russos know exactly what they're doing with it. Since we're talking about why Doom is the right villain for a film at this scale, it's worth being specific about what he actually brings to a confrontation, because the answer is quite a lot, and the specifics matter when you're thinking about what a group of heroes, even this group, would actually need to do to stop him. The sorcerer-scientist combination is the thing to start with. The MCU has plenty of engineers. It has plenty of magic users. Doom is both, at a level comparable to the best in either discipline. In the comics, he's considered a match for Doctor Strange in magical ability and for Reed Richards in scientific capability, while being physically more capable than either of them in a direct confrontation. That combination, that you cannot defeat him with any single toolkit, is what makes him consistently resistant to the heroes in his own comics and what makes him the right antagonist for a film that has this many differently powered people in it. There's also the matter of the armour. The iron suit Doom wears is not decorative. It's a complete technological system, defensive capabilities, offensive capabilities, flight, communication, a sealed environment that means he can't be affected by things that would affect an unprotected human. And unlike most armoured characters in the MCU, Doom didn't build a suit to compensate for a lack of innate ability. He built it in addition to his existing capabilities. The man inside the armour is already formidable. The armour just removes the vulnerabilities, which is not a comforting thought when you're trying to work out where the weak point is. His intelligence is probably the most dangerous thing. Not in the sense of raw processing speed. The MCU has various characters who can think quickly, but in the sense of strategic depth over long time frames. Doom plans across decades in the comics. He sets events in motion that take generations to resolve. He wins confrontations not by being stronger, but by having already thought further ahead than anyone else in the room. In a film about the multiverse where the enemy has apparently been planning for quite some time and has already identified Franklin Richards, already made contact with the Fantastic Four's universe, and apparently assembled multiple powerful allies, that strategic depth is probably the hero's actual problem. There's no clever third act reversal that beats a man who already accounted for it. The magical dimension of his capabilities is the one that creates the most interesting matchups. The MCU has established a kind of implicit hierarchy of magical ability, the Sorcerer Supreme at the top, with various characters operating at different levels below. Doom in the comics frequently operates at or above that hierarchy. He has studied forms of magic that the Karmatage tradition doesn't cover. He has access to powers that the established sorcerers in the MCU can't necessarily account for or counter with their existing knowledge. Doctor Strange, who is expected to appear in Doomsday, despite being somewhat mysteriously absent from the confirmed cast announcement, would presumably be the hero's primary magical asset against Doom. That matchup, the Sorcerer Supreme against someone who has been a sorcerer considerably longer and has a different tradition entirely, is one of the more interesting implied confrontations in the film's structure. There's also the question of his political capabilities. Doom is a head of state. He has diplomatic immunity in the comics universe, which creates legal and procedural complications that superhero logic usually glosses over, but the MCU has occasionally been quite good at acknowledging. He operates at the intersection of legitimate power and illegitimate methods, which makes him difficult to address through conventional, heroic means. You can't just fight Doom. You have to find a way to fight him that doesn't make the heroes look like they're attacking a sovereign nation's leader without cause, which is a specific kind of problem that punching generally doesn't solve. The Latvian people issue is relevant here too. In the comics, Doom's people love him in a complicated but real way, and attacking him means attacking the person they've chosen or been given, depending on how you frame it, to protect them. The MCU may not go into this in any depth, but it's worth knowing that the villain the heroes are fighting has subjects who would describe him as a good ruler, which is not a complication most MCU antagonists come with. All of which is to say that the threat Doom represents in Doomsday is not primarily a physical one. He can fight very well, but he wins through intelligence, through preparation, through having already assembled what he needs before anyone else understood what was happening. The heroes beating him will presumably require not just the ability to match him in a confrontation, but the ability to understand in advance what he's actually building, which, given the film's reported structure, the incursions, Franklin Richards, Wanda, the Void, the allies he's assembling, is a considerably more complex task than any single Avengers film has asked of its heroes before. Since we've now covered all 7 of the confirmed X-Men characters in Doomsday, Beast, Nightcrawler, Cyclops, Gambit, Magneto, Mystique, and Professor X, there's something worth saying about what their collective presence means beyond the specifics of any individual character. This is the end of the Fox X-Men franchise. That's what's happening, at least in terms of these actors in these roles. The MCU will eventually introduce its own X-Men, a new Wolverine, a new Jean Grey, a fresh start with younger actors in an ongoing series. That's clearly coming. But before that happens, Doomsday is bringing back the original cast one last time in a proper film, alongside the Avengers they've never shared a screen with, and giving the Fox X-Men their version of a goodbye. The Fox X-Men franchise ran from 2000 to 2019, if you count Dark Phoenix as the technical final chapter. That's nearly 20 years. Needs review. Patrick Stewart played Professor X across 7 films, from the first X-Men in 2000 through to Logan in 2017. Ian McKellen played Magneto across 5. Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, who isn't confirmed for Doomsday but appeared in Deadpool, and Wolverine in 2024, ran for 26 years. These are the longest character runs in superhero film history, and the franchise that produced them was, at its best, X-Men 2, Days of Future Past, Logan, genuinely important cinema rather than just successful entertainment. It was also, at its worst, a franchise that made some very poor decisions about which characters to prioritise and which to underserve. Cyclops, as we've already discussed, is the most obvious example, but the franchise also never quite figured out what to do with Storm across several attempts, wasted a lot of potential on the Phoenix storyline twice, and ended with Dark Phoenix, which is not the valediction that franchise deserved. Doomsday is, in some ways, trying to give the best of those actors and those characters a more fitting farewell. Whether it succeeds is something we'll know after December, but the ambition of it, reuniting McKellen, Stewart, Marsden, Grammer, Cumming, Romine and Tatum in a film with a budget and a scope commensurate with what those actors and those characters actually are, is not a small thing to attempt. Patrick Stewart's Professor X deserves its own sentence here, because he hasn't come up yet in his own right. He appeared in the MCU briefly in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness as the Earth 838 variant of Xavier, which was a wonderful cameo, and which established that the Fox X-Men universe is accessible to the MCU through the multiverse. Doomsday is the fulfillment of that promise. The version of Professor X who exists in Doom's conflict is Stewart's version, the one with the decades of history, the lifelong friendship and rivalry with Magneto, the school, the losses, the conviction that humans and mutants can coexist if given the chance. Per some of what's been reported, flagged clearly as unconfirmed, Professor X has a significant confrontation with Doom himself. Given what we know about Doom potentially absorbing or interacting with the Void, and given Xavier's psychic capabilities being described by the end of the Logan timeline as a potential weapon of mass destruction in the wrong circumstances, the specific nature of a Doom versus Xavier confrontation is one of the more interesting implied matchups in the film. The emotional weight of that matchup, if it happens, is considerable. Stewart has been playing this character for well over 2 decades. He has brought genuine depth and warmth to a role that could have been purely symbolic. Seeing him in a final confrontation with a villain of this scale is the kind of thing that only works because of the history. Not the plot history, the felt history. What audiences have actually experienced watching him over 2.5 decades? That's what the Fox X-Men franchise ultimately earned. Not just box office, not just cultural footprint. It earned the weight that these actors carry into any scene they're in, because they've done the work long enough that it's real rather than performed. And Doomsday, by bringing them back one last time, is trying to spend that earned weight in service of something genuinely significant. Whether that's the right call, whether this is the proper goodbye, or whether a proper goodbye for the Fox X-Men would have been something more contained and specific to those characters, is a question I'll probably be sitting with after December 2. Something I haven't talked about yet, and which feels relevant to the villain side of this film, even though they're not villains. The original Avengers who are returning. Chris Evans is back as Steve Rogers. Chris Hemsworth is back as Thor, both confirmed via the film's official teasers. Both characters who had, by most reasonable assessments, complete arcs going into this. Steve went back to the 1940s to live his life with Peggy Carter. Thor went off with the Guardians, with love, into an uncertain future that felt deliberately open. Neither of them ended in a way that obviously demanded a return. Evans said he would only come back if there was a genuine story reason for it, a specific need that only Steve Rogers could fill. Not just the nostalgic value of seeing the character again. And by all accounts, the Doomsday script provided exactly that. His quote, roughly, was that the story gave him a very real reason that these heroes need Steve Rogers now. Given what we know about Loki's position in the film, the thing Doom is targeting, the thing Thor and Steve are apparently tasked with protecting, that reason seems fairly clear without needing to be stated directly. Thor's teaser is described as having a notably more serious tone than his Love and Thunder appearance, which will come as a relief to a segment of the audience, and an adjustment for another. The Taika Waititi films took Thor in a comedic direction that worked brilliantly in Ragnarok and mixed more unpredictably in Love and Thunder. The teasers for Doomsday suggest the Russos are returning him to something closer to the Thor of Infinity War, still capable of humour, but with genuine weight behind it. What these two specifically bring to the villain conversation, beyond just original Avengers returning, is what they represent to Loki. Steve Rogers and Loki have a history that's mostly adversarial, punctuated by a few memorable moments of forced cooperation. But more importantly, Steve represents the old guard, the people who were there from the beginning, who remember what the Avengers were assembled to do and why. His presence in a film about Loki's role as the multiverse's guardian is almost narratively necessary. The man who assembled the first time to fight Loki is now fighting alongside everything Loki has become. Thor and Loki's relationship is the emotional underpinning of a significant portion of the MCU. 3 Thor films and 2 Avengers films of brotherly conflict, betrayal, genuine love, loss, and eventual maturation into something neither of them could have predicted when they were fighting over who should rule Asgard. A reunion between them in Doomsday, with Loki in his current status as the being holding everything together, and Thor in his role as the person most personally invested in protecting him, is the kind of beat the MCU has genuinely earned across more than a decade of storytelling. Whether earned always translates to well executed is a separate question. But the ingredients are there. From the villain's perspective, Doom targeting Loki and the heroes most invested in protecting Loki being Steve and Thor is a structurally elegant choice. It's not random. It's the villain identifying the right pressure points. The Guardian, whose removal opens the multiverse to what Doom wants to do. And the heroes, who respond not just because Loki is strategically important, but because they have specific personal reasons to show up. That's how the best confrontations in this kind of film work. Not heroes fight villain. Heroes who care about a specific thing fight a villain who wants that specific thing. There's also Buck E. Barnes, Sebastian Stan confirmed, who comes with all the weight of his relationship with Steve without needing to be re-established in any detail. And Hawkeye, Jeremy Renner, who's been absent from most of Phase 5, and whose return here feels both like a thank you to a character who deserved a better send-off than his last major appearance provided, and like a recognition that an Avengers film without Clint Barton is missing something. The original Avengers returning in this context aren't just fan service, or at least they don't need to be. Their presence reflects the specific shape of the threat. Doctor Doom is not just any villain. He's the kind of threat that requires you to call in everyone you have, including the people who thought they were done. That specific quality, the threat that makes retired heroes come back, is something the MCU has used before to significant effect. And the reason it works is that you believe in why these specific people are needed. Not just that the story required a big cast. There's one more confirmed antagonist worth talking about, and she's interesting for exactly the opposite reasons from most of the characters we've covered tonight. Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays Valentina Allegoru du Fontaine Val, who has been operating in the background of the MCU since her first appearance in The Falcon and The Winter Soldier. She's a CIA director of considerable power and deliberately murky motivations. She assembled the Thunderbolts. She used Bob Reynolds as a propaganda tool. She covered up the origins of the Sentry Enhancement Program. She positioned herself as the government's answer to the question of what to do with powerful people who don't fit conventional heroic categories. She's confirmed for Doomsday as part of the new Avengers structure, which puts her in a complicated position. The person who assembled the team, now nominally on the side of the people fighting Doom, having spent the preceding films being the quietly sinister hand behind several things that cause significant harm. What makes Val interesting as a villain type, and she is at minimum a villain-adjacent figure, even if she ends up fighting on the right side in Doomsday, is the method. She never gets her own hands dirty. She doesn't have powers. She doesn't fight anyone directly. She operates through leverage, information, deniability, asset management, the careful positioning of other people as tools. She turned Bob Reynolds' psychological vulnerability into a government asset and then a public relations instrument. She assembled a team of damaged people and branded them as her creation when they succeeded. She's the kind of villain who is genuinely frightening in a different register from cosmic threats and armoured conquerors. Because the harm she does is real, Bob's story in Thunderbolts is substantially a story about what happens when someone's deepest wounds are systematically exploited for institutional benefit, and it's harm that doesn't get addressed through a final battle. You can't punch Val and T na a leg ruhta von Tane's moral record into correction. Her presence in Doomsday alongside the new Avengers she assembled is one of the more interesting narrative questions the film inherits from Thunderbolts. The team knows who she is and what she did. The film will need to decide how much screen time it wants to devote to that tension in the context of an already crowded story. But her being there at all, in the same frame as Bob Reynolds, is not a neutral choice. What Val represents thematically in a film full of people with sincere convictions is the alternative. Someone operating entirely on self-interest, with no belief system underneath, and no wound driving her forward. She positions people, manages outcomes, covers her tracks. There's no grief in her, no philosophy underneath the manoeuvring. Just the mechanics of getting what she wants next and a talent for ensuring the wreckage lands on other people. After a full night of talking about villains who have complicated tragedies underneath their terrible choices, that's almost a relief, not in a positive way. In the way that a cold and calculating antagonist is sometimes easier to look at clearly than a sympathetic one. She's not wrong about anything in a way you have to sit with. She's just someone doing harmful things for ordinary recognizable reasons, career power, self-preservation, and calling it service. Now, having gone through all of these characters individually, the primary villain, the potential lieutenants, the returning antagonists turned allies, the former villains now on the right side, the villain variants, let me take a step back and think about the larger shape of what this film is attempting, because it's genuinely unusual. Most ensemble films, even the MCU's largest ones, have a relatively clear structural organisation. Infinity War split its characters into groups across multiple locations, each pursuing a different objective in the same overall mission to stop THAN-OATs. Endgame assembled everyone at the end for a single confrontation. The organisational logic was spatial and temporal, different people in different places eventually converging. Doomsday appears to be organising its characters differently. The reports that have come out about the film's structure suggest multiple factions in multiple universes, with objectives that aren't all pointed at the same thing simultaneously. The Avengers and New Avengers assembling in Earth 616, the X-Men and Fantastic Four operating from Earth 828, or moving between universes via America Chavez's portal. A mission that apparently involves simultaneously stopping the incursions, rescuing Monique Rambeau from a collapsed universe, protecting Loki, and preventing Doom from using Franklin Richards, all of which are different threads, not all of which are directly compatible. That's a lot to hold together in a single film. The question of whether it holds together is the central uncertainty about Doomsday as a piece of filmmaking, and it's a legitimate one. Avengers: Infinity War managed a sprawling cast by being ruthlessly clear about priorities in each scene. Endgame handled its large assembly by giving the first two-thirds of the film to a much smaller group and then opening up for the finale. Doomsday, from the reports, seems to be attempting something more structurally complex from the beginning, which is either going to be the thing that makes it the best film of the saga or the thing that makes it the most ambitious failure. I lean at this particular moment toward cautious optimism, partly because the Russo brothers have demonstrated twice that they can manage ensemble films of this scale without losing the character threads, partly because the cast is so good that even a structurally imperfect film is going to have moments that land purely on the strength of who's in a given scene together, and partly because the villain is, by design, one of the most complex Marvel has ever attempted. And a great villain can do a lot of structural heavy lifting by giving the audience someone to organise their attention around. The interesting villains on tonight's list, and most of them, are in various ways interesting. All share the quality of having a comprehensible interiority. You can understand why they are what they are, even if you can't endorse what they've become. Doom with his lost family, Magneto with his historical wounds and his achieved utopia under threat. Wanda with the children she cannot stop trying to reach. Loki, the former antagonist, now serving as the structure holding everything together, functioning as a protagonist in his own right. The Void as a man's worst day, given cosmic scale. What ties them, beyond the individual details, is a question about what people do with loss. Almost everyone on this list, hero, villain, and the many characters in between, has lost something significant. The distinction between the people who end up fighting Doom and the people who end up fighting with him is not about how much they lost, or how deeply it hurt. It's about what they decided to do with the wound. Whether the loss became a reason to be more careful, more present, more committed to protecting what remains, or whether it became a reason to decide that the universe owed them the authority to prevent loss from ever happening again. Doom decided the latter, and he's been working toward it, apparently, for quite a long time. The heroes are going to try to stop him. They're probably right to. The cost of what Doom proposes is freedom, everyone else's freedom, restructured as a function of his will and his certainty and his grief. That's not a universe saved, that's a universe controlled. But stopping him leaves the problem. The incursions, the multiverse without a structural solution. Loki, alone, holding threads that need something more permanent. Avengers, Secret Wars arriving next December, is presumably where the positive answer lives. Doomsday might be the film that demonstrates, very specifically, what the wrong answer looks like at maximum scale. This is the kind of thought that occurs to me at this particular hour. So bear with me for a moment. We've talked about 15 plus characters tonight who occupy the villain side of things in Doomsday. Confirmed, reported, formally, currently, adjacent to. And the thing that keeps striking me, looking at them as a collection, is how few of them fit the conventional definition of what a villain is supposed to be. The conventional villain is someone who wants things that are clearly wrong, for reasons that don't require much explanation, and who can be opposed without significant moral complication. The MCU occasionally produces those. Ronan in the first Guardians film is the closest thing. A genuine fanatic, with no complexity worth excavating. But they're the exception rather than the rule, and they tend to be the least interesting entries in the franchise's villain catalogue. As we talked about earlier in the context of Doom and Killmonger, almost all of the best MCU antagonists are people whose analysis of the situation is partially right, and whose wrongness lives specifically in the response. That pattern runs through this entire list, from Doom down to Namor. It's the thing they share across all the differences in scale and power and method. A correct reading of the problem and a catastrophic choice about what to do with that reading. Thanos was the version of this that, by most assessments, managed to hold the spectacle and the philosophy together. He was frightening and philosophically interesting, and also a convincing physical threat. Doomsday is apparently trying to do the same thing with a villain who operates at a different register, less openly emotional, more controlled, more certain, less sorrowful about what he's decided to do, which requires a different kind of work from the film and a different kind of attention from the audience. I'm curious in the way I find myself curious about things at this hour, not urgently, not anxiously, just genuinely curious whether it pulls it off. We'll find out together in December. There's a handful of confirmed cast members I've touched on only glancingly that deserve a proper sentence or two before we head toward the end of this, because they're interesting in their own right, even if their villain credentials are thinner than most of what we've covered tonight. Shang-Chi Simu Liu is confirmed, and his presence is one of the things I'm genuinely curious about, partly because he's been almost entirely absent from the MCU since his 2021 solo film. Simu Liu described the character as older, more self-assured, a little more lived in with his sense of who he is and what his responsibilities are. The 10 rings, which he now wields, are an ongoing mystery even after his film. The rings lit up at the end, signalling something outside the known universe, and that thread has been left hanging for 5 years. Whether Doomsday addresses what answered that signal is one of the more interesting loose threads the MCU has available. Black Panther, Letitia writes, Shuri is confirmed, and the Waka and Dun contingent comes with its own internal dynamics, worth briefly noting. M'Baku, Winston Duke confirmed, provides both the Jabari tribe's involvement and one of the more consistently entertaining character energies in the Black Panther corner of the MCU. Shuri, having taken up the mantle after T'Challa's death, makes her the specific combination of genius and warrior that this fight by all accounts requires. And her relationship with Namor, the truce established at the end of Wakanda Forever, the complicated history between Wakanda and Talokan, provides at least one interesting interpersonal dynamic in a film that needs its character threads to give the spectacle weight. Ant-Man, Paul Rudd's Scott Lang, is confirmed, and Scott's position is an interesting one. After Quan Tum Mei Ni Ye, he defeated one version of Kang in the quantum realm and then had to sit with the knowledge that there were essentially infinite others waiting. The transition from that specific threat to this one, from Kang to Doom, presumably requires the film to acknowledge that the Kang problem isn't resolved so much as the film's approach to the Multiverse Saga changed direction, and Scott's experience in the quantum realm is probably part of how the film contextualizes that. America Chavez, Xochitl Gomez, is confirmed, and given the logistics of moving people between universes, is presumably the mechanism by which the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and the Avengers end up in the same place at the same time. Her power, punching portals between realities, makes her one of the most important structural assets in a film about multiple universes colliding. She's been at Karmatage since Multiverse of Madness, training to control her ability. Doomsday is presumably where that training gets put to the largest possible use. And then there's Tom Holland's Spider-Man, who is expected to appear despite not being officially confirmed in the initial cast announcement. The ambiguity around his involvement makes sense given the specific nature of where No Way Home left Peter Parker, alone, memory wiped from the world's perspective, starting from nothing. His presence in a film about the Avengers reassembling would require the film to acknowledge that most of them don't know who he is. That's an interesting structural wrinkle that I'd like to see addressed rather than glossed over. There's also the matter of Doctor Strange, Benedict Cumberbatch, who similarly hasn't been officially confirmed, but whose absence would be conspicuous enough to constitute a different kind of story decision. The Sorcerer Supreme in a film about a villain who is himself a sorcerer scientist of the highest order is too obvious a confrontation to pass up, and the marketing silence on his involvement feels more like strategic misdirection than actual absence. Since we're also on the topic of characters the film is building around, Cassie Lang, Catherine Newton confirmed, provides the Pym family generational thread. Hayley Atwell's Peggy Carter is apparently returning in some capacity, which presumably relates to Steve Rogers' arc, and what bringing him back from his life in the 1940s actually costs him emotionally. Thor's daughter Love, India Rose Hemsworth, is listed as expected to appear. The family threads in this film are, beneath the cosmic spectacle, what's doing the emotional work, and the villain's motivation, if the reported backstory holds, is itself a family story. What's interesting about Doom specifically, in this context of all these families, is that his plan is essentially the same impulse that motivates many of the heroes, protecting the people he loves from being taken. He's just doing it at an existence warping scale, and doing it in a way that requires everyone else's existence to be restructured as a function of his protection. The difference between Doom's motivation and Reed Richards' motivation in that framing is not the desire, it's the willingness to let the method define you. Since we're fairly close to the end of tonight, and it's that sort of hour when thoughts get a bit looser, let me talk about something I find genuinely pleasant about where we are right now in relation to this film. There's a specific kind of experience that only exists in the window between a major film being announced and it actually arriving. Right now, Avengers. Doomsday is still, in a meaningful sense, many films simultaneously. It's the film where Doom is a tragic figure operating with genuine moral complexity. It's the film where he's a straightforward villain who gets comprehensively beaten. It's the film where Wanda returns and finds something like peace. It's the film where she doesn't. It's the film that does justice to the Fox X-Men's decades-long legacy. It's the film that uses them primarily as a farewell gesture and focuses the story elsewhere. All of these versions exist right now. December will collapse them into one. There's something I've always found interesting about that moment of collapse. The way a single film, once seen, replaces every version of it you'd imagined. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to the version in your head where Cyclops got the scene the Fox films never gave him, if it turns out Doomsday doesn't give him that scene either. The actual film, once watched, becomes the only version you have, which is partly why conversations like this one, the conversations that happen before the film arrives, have a particular quality to them. They're not wrong in the way that specific predictions can be wrong. They're just imaginative engagement with possibility space. And that's a perfectly good thing to do at 1 a.m, when there's no deadline and no one's checking your work. The confirmed villains for Doomsday, as a collection, are among the more interesting assemblages the MCU has ever put together, not just in terms of power level or comic book significance, though they're considerable on both counts, but in terms of the variety of reasons each of them ended up on the wrong side of whatever line the film will draw. Doom from grief and certainty, Magneto from history and the threat to what he finally built, Wanda from loss that simply wouldn't let her go, the void from pain that was given a name and a scale that no one anticipated, villain variants as the dark possibilities of people the audience loves. Namor from a historical accuracy that turned into a structural reflex, John Walker, Ghost, Red Guardian, people who crossed the line and came back across it, carrying the knowledge of what it looked like from the other side. No one in that list, except perhaps the villain variants, is simply evil. Most of them would, if you asked, give you a coherent account of why they did or believed what they did. Some of those accounts are more defensible than others. A few of them, if you're being genuinely honest, are almost entirely defensible right up until the moment they aren't. That's what makes a villain actually interesting, rather than just threatening. Not the power, not the spectacle, the moment where you can still follow their reasoning, and then the step where you can't, and having to sit with where exactly that step was. Since we're close to the word count, I wanted, and this feels like a natural thing to know if you're going into December with this film on your radar, the story of how Avengers Doomsday became about Doctor Doom rather than Kang the Conqueror is interesting in its own right. The film was originally titled Avengers, the Kang Dynasty. Jonathan Majors had played Kang, or variants of him, across Loki, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantum Mania, and Loki Season 2. He was set to be the central villain of both new Avengers films. He was, in several ways, already established at scale in the narrative, the He Who Remains of the season. One Loki finale, the exiled Kang of Quantum Mania, the Council of Kangs lurking at the edges of the multiverse. Then Majors was arrested in 2023 and subsequently dismissed from the franchise following his conviction, which left Marvel with a significant problem. A villain woven through several recent projects, now removed, with 2 films already in development, built around his continued presence. The solution they arrived at, bringing back Robert Downey Jr. as a different character entirely, rewriting the film's villain and subtitle accordingly, was both pragmatic and, as it turned out, potentially inspired. Not because Kang wasn't a viable villain. Quantum Mania had some significant issues in how he was deployed, but the character concept was sound, and the multiverse architecture built around him still exists in Loki. But because Doom is, by most assessments, a better villain than Kang for this particular kind of film, not more powerful, not more thematically interesting necessarily, but more emotionally legible, more immediately comprehensible as a person with a specific interiority rather than a concept with a face. Kang's threat was about scale and repetition. Not one villain, but infinite variants, an army that replenished itself by definition. It's a fascinating structural idea that Loki explored brilliantly in the character of He Who Remains. But as a film antagonist for a team of heroes, enemy that can't be defeated because there's always another one, is a genuinely difficult problem to give a satisfying dramatic shape to. Doom is singular, one man, one specific wound, one very particular plan. That's not simpler than the Kang problem. His plan is apparently enormously complex, but it's dramatically manageable, in a way the multiverse of Kangs never quite was. The version of the multiverse threat that survived the pivot from Kang is essentially the Incursion's architecture and the Loki Asgardian structure. Those don't require Kang to function, and the specific personal history that makes Doom an interesting villain, the family, the loss, the certainty, can be layered onto the same structural threat without the story needing to start from scratch. Whether all of that lands smoothly, whether a casual viewer who's been following along since Phase 4 will find the transition from Kang's threat to Doom's threat intuitive is a legitimate question. The production made the best of a genuinely difficult situation. That doesn't guarantee the seams won't show, but from the outside, looking at the cast and the reported structure and the ingredients, it looks like the pivot might end up being one of those accidents that improves on the original plan. We'll find out in December, which for now is the only honest answer available. And on that note, that's probably the right place to stop for tonight. A conqueror from the 31st century who lost his family to a collapsing reality and decided the answer was to become God Emperor of whatever remained. An old mutant who wanted his people safe and built something close to that, and now watches it be threatened by someone operating at an entirely different scale. A shapeshifter who spent 25 years of film history learning to be one specific thing, coming back for one more round. A blue scientist who hasn't had a proper story in 18 years. A teleporter who stepped away for over 2 decades. A field commander the franchise systematically underserved for 2 full decades who might finally get his moment. A Cajun with kinetic energy and apparently a proper accent this time. Loki, somewhere at the centre of all of it, maintaining the multiverse's stability through sheer will, while something very powerful and very certain works its way toward him. Bob Reynolds, in a support structure of people who genuinely love him, trying very carefully not to become the thing that he carries. Juan Dua Maxi Moff, maybe, somewhere on the wrong side of this story, because someone offered her the one thing she cannot say no to, and she's a person for whom that specific vulnerability has been demonstrated before, and a man in an iron mask who believes, sincerely and with an enormous amount of evidence, that he is the only one capable of doing what needs to be done. Holding a child's hand in a living room in a building called the Baxter, certain that this version of things, his version, the one he controls, is better than the alternative. Having gone through all of them tonight, the confirmed ones, the heavily reported ones, the ones who arrived as villains and left as something more complicated, the thing that stands out most is how few of them are actually doing this for reasons you can't at least partially understand. Most of them have something concrete underneath, something that went wrong, or was taken, or was never given in the first place. A conviction that started from somewhere reasonable and ended up somewhere terrible. Ask most of them, and they'd say they were the only ones thinking clearly, the only ones prepared to do what the situation genuinely called for. And the thread running under all of this, the one the MCU has been developing across its entire run, is that what separates these people from the heroes facing them usually isn't the depth of the wound. It's the direction they pointed it, whether the loss became a reason to be more careful with the next thing, or a license to take the next thing by force. Same starting conditions, different conclusions. December 18th, that's when we find out which version of Doomsday is the real one. For now though, and this is a perfectly good place to rest, they're all still possible. Doom is still simultaneously the tragedy and the threat. Wanda is still maybe coming back. The X-Men are still preparing for their last chapter under these actors and these faces. Loki is sitting at the center of everything, holding threads, being patient in the way that only someone who has genuinely changed can be patient. And somewhere out there, a small boy named Franklin is looking at a figure in a green cloak with curiosity rather than fear, in a living room, in a building called the Baxter, while his mother hasn't yet come back into the room. That image is enough. For now, that's enough.